Many of you want to know what U.S. Army Flight School is like, so this will be me sharing my experience on my 1.5 years at Army Flight School. So initially, when you get accepted to flight school, you're pretty excited about your new journey of becoming an Army pilot and going to Fort Rucker, Alabama. But when you arrive at Fort Rucker, you don't immediately jump into an aircraft and start flying. No.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
For a commissioned officer like myself, you have a few months of classes that you need to go through in order to learn how the Army operates. Classes like how to do OERs or evaluation reports, inventories, etc. You know, the things that you always have to do consistently as an Army officer, but at that time you don't really realize that you don't know how to do yet. These days were typically easy, starting at 9 a.m. and ending at about 5 p.m. with very little study time afterwards required. Still studying though, but not too much. A couple months after this, you go to SEER. So then you start Common Core. And this is where, probably for the first time in your life, you feel like you may not have enough space in your brain to literally know, understand, and comprehend all of the information that's being thrown at you consistently on a daily basis. So Common Core is where you start to actually learn how to fly a helicopter. You start out pretty simple, learning the basics, how to turn left, how to turn right, how to climb, how to descend, and how to do those things at the same time. This, in my opinion, is where flight school started to really get very difficult. For the first time in my life, I just felt like there was not enough time in the day to memorize and really get to really know the information that was being put out to me every single day. Here's what the days were like. I chose to live on post. You have the option of living on or on post. I enjoyed my sleep, so I wanted to get a little bit extra sleep by being able to sleep in an extra 10 minutes a day and not having to commute, so I lived on post. My days started typically at 4 in the morning. I'd wake up at 4 and I'd have to go to the bus stop to catch the bus to the flight line. Once you get to the flight line, clearly the sun's not up yet, you start to work on your things that you're gonna do for that day. Usually your performance planning for the aircraft, checking weather, NOTAMs, everything that you're gonna typically do before the flight. And all of this is done manually. You have to go through the book and find the performance numbers and do the calculations to do a performance planning chart manually. And next up you have daily questions. This, for me, in my opinion, was the most stressful part of flight school. Every day you receive about 10 to 15 daily questions that you need to answer for the next day. When you're first starting out, these daily questions are usually aircraft emergency procedures and aircraft limitations. Each one of these daily questions is typically about a paragraph worth of information, and you have to go home and memorize 10 to 15 paragraphs worth of information. The next day you're gonna come back in and you're gonna get selected randomly to recite verbatim an entire one of those random paragraphs. And you have to have every single word correct. If you say and instead of or, it could change the meaning of the entire emergency procedure, so that will be an incorrect daily question answer, and you would most likely get an unsatisfactory. This was very stressful for me. And not only does day one count, the next day you get another 15 questions to memorize, and the next day you get another 15. And each additional day, all of the previous day's questions are fair game. So you're constantly piling on the amount of information. On day 17, they might ask you, hey, recite paragraph 2 from day 1. Your brain starts to feel like you just don't have enough space to fit this information. And it gets very overwhelming very quickly. And the daily questions continue for the 1.5 years that you're in flight school. I hated the daily questions, but I felt like if I could get the daily questions down and get my day started off with getting that correct, then the rest of the day was downhill from there. For some reason, that was the hardest part of the day for me, and you started that before the sun even came up. After a certain amount of time, you really start to feel like you don't have the capacity to add any more information to your brain to be able to memorize and recall verbatim. And we have a saying for this, it's called penguins.
Yo, you about done? Tick tock, mother.
And you'll probably hear this if you go to flight school, but it's called penguins on an iceberg. An iceberg is only so big, and you can only fit so many penguins on there. Eventually, if you're gonna keep trying to add penguins on there, one of the penguins on the back half is gonna fall off. And this is just a metaphor for how your brain's going to work. If you keep putting information in it, you're at some point going to forget some of the information that you may have learned a month ago or a month and a half ago. So what we need to do is prioritize which penguins are we going to keep on the iceberg and which penguins are we going to let fall off. And it's really hard when you're initially in flight school to figure out which ones to let fall off, because you never know which ones they're going to ask you, and it's a struggle to constantly try to keep as many penguins on this damn iceberg as you can without letting the important ones fall off. After you complete your daily questions, you go out and you fly the aircraft, usually for 1 or 1.5 hours. You'll swap time with your stick buddy, and you have performance objective in the aircraft that you need to meet by a certain time. By a certain amount of hours, you better know how to hover. By a certain amount of hours, you better know how to fly the aircraft and communicate, rub your belly, and pat your head at the same time. And keep in mind, this is only the first half of the day. The second half of the day is usually academics. Not always. Sometimes you do academics first and then fly in the afternoon, but for this scenario, we're just going to go with academics in the afternoon. Academics is where you learn everything about flying the aircraft: instruments, aerodynamics, weather, airport markings, all the publications that you needed to go. And you're going to go through each publication page by page and pick out all of the information that you need to know that's relevant for being an Army aviator and the FAA rules as well. In your academic portion of your flight school career, you'll have an exam typically about every 2 weeks. So you learn something and you'll get tested on something. But these aren't your typical exams. These exams you can somehow fail and still get a 90%.
How, Sway?
So let's say you have an exam with 100 questions. That 100 question exam is going to be broken down into 10 subsections. You're only allowed to miss a certain amount of points in each section. So for example, if you get 10 questions wrong in one section and get the other 90 correct, you would fail the exam because you're only allowed to miss 1 or 2 or maybe 3 in each section. So now it's about 5 p.m. You go home, you have dinner, and then you have to study all of your daily questions for the next day. You might have time to study your academic portions for the next day. You might have to plan your flight for the next day, but there's literally no time to even turn your TV on or have fun or relax or go do any hobbies that you might think you have. In flight school, you probably won't have them for quite some time. After Common Core, I moved on to instruments. I really enjoyed instruments because I could finally take a breath and relax. And for some reason, instruments came really easy to me. I just enjoyed flying instruments way more than I did flying Common Core. 90% of that had to do with my instructor. My instruments instructor was very calm and very relaxed and not very abrasive. My Common Core instructor was. So the culture changed, the vibe changed. I can relax, I can breathe, and I actually learned a lot better in that environment than I did in the Common Core environment. So to this day, I think because of that, I prefer and really like and enjoy instruments. And plus, being able to learn how to fly a helicopter from A to B without ever looking outside was pretty awesome. It was very rewarding seeing the work that I've done to this point come into play and come into effect and actually make a difference, and that I've actually really learned something and I could do it. This was the first time that I actually felt like I was doing pilot things. So after instruments is BWS, or basic warfighting skills. This is where you learn how to fly tactically, or tactical flying. And this is the most fun part of flight school by far, in my opinion. All the stuff that you see in the movies, flying low, yanking and banking, and flying down between the trees and flying lakes and riverbeds, that's all you do in BWS every single day. You still have your daily questions every day. You still have your academics on the second half of the day, but your flying is absolutely the best flying that you'll probably do in flight school. And again, my instructor in BWS, or basic warfighting skills, was also a more relaxed approach, and this made me really enjoy my BWS course. At this point, I was about 7 to 8 months into flight school, and next up was selection. A lot of you had questions on selection and how it worked. I'll make a video on that. If I've already made it, I'll link it here. If not, then it'll be somewhere. Selection is when everybody figures out what aircraft they're going to fly pretty much forever. For my class, we had the option of Blackhawks, Chinooks, Apaches, and if you're in the reserves or National Guard, you already know what aircraft you're going to fly. So we get removed from the OML, or the Order of Merit list of all the pilots. We get taken out and we get to just watch the active duty pilots compete for what aircraft they want. After selection day, your class breaks up and everybody starts a different pipeline. If you're going to fly Blackhawks, you start over here. If you're going to go fly Chinooks, Apaches, or C-12s, C-12 pilots also start off in the Blackhawk anyway. But everybody splits up and you start a new pipeline, essentially starting flight school all over again, but now you're going to do it in a Blackhawk. At this point, the culture changes a little bit. It's much more, okay, if you've made it this far, you're probably going to graduate. So, big boy rules. And what I mean by big boy rules is the Army kind of knows that you're going to make it through. So, if you don't want to put in the time and effort to study, if you don't want to put in the time and effort to be a great pilot, then you're just going to be a terrible pilot when you get to your unit. And that's on you at this point. So, the flight line, which was great, we can show up early or as early as we want to, which the downside to this was, if your instructor wants to talk to you for 3 hours after the class about questions, which my instructor did, we'll be there until, after sunset, until it's 8 or 9 o'clock at night. Because we have our own car and we can just drive whenever we want to. There's no bus to go catch. In the Black Hawk course is where I had my most challenging exam. That was Black Hawk Systems. That one got me pretty good. I had a class average of a 92. I won't tell you what I got on that test, but that one got me pretty good. There was just so much to learn in a short amount of time that I did the worst. That was my worst exam that I took during flight school, was my Black Hawk Systems. So academics stayed difficult, got harder sometimes at some point, but I think flying the aircraft got easier because at this point you've been doing it for 10, 11 months. Once I finished that Black Hawk Systems exam is where I felt that flight school really got way easier, right? You kind of passed the hump and it was downhill from there. Because once you start to truly understand the Black Hawk systems, all of the stuff that you've been memorizing to this point started to become second nature. Once you really understood the system, you were no longer memorizing. You were just understanding how everything worked. And then you realized an emergency procedure was just the systems working with each other, and it just made sense. And you no longer had to really just rogue memorize things. You just had to literally think through the process of what would happen to whatever system. And then you realize one day, holy shit, that's the emergency procedure. Once that clicked, flight school became easy. I enjoyed the rest of my time in Fort Rucker. Not a lot of people enjoy Fort Rucker because of the environment that you're in. But once things actually start to make sense and mesh, and it's literally probably the last 2 months that you're there, it's not as bad as the first 14 months that you've been there. After that, your family gets to come and see you graduate. You graduate with about 130 or 140 hours of flight time. And now you get to your unit and you start training all over again because you really don't know anything yet. You just know how to keep yourself alive in the aircraft. When you get to your unit, now it's time to really learn how to implement the aircraft into a specific mission. And you have about a year of training once you get to your unit. So this was my experience in flight school. I know a lot of you guys have been waiting for this video for a long time. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments. I will make a video to answer all of your questions that you might have. Or if there's anything you would like to see, let me know. I'll also make a video on that as well. If you found this information useful or helpful, or if you learned something today, subscribe or like. I'd really appreciate it. And I'll see you guys next time.